Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Pam Franks, and I'm WICMA's Class of 1956 Director. I'm delighted to welcome you as we gather together in this space at Williams College, which we respectfully acknowledge sits on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continue as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Tonight's talk is part of the Bolin Legacy Mentorship Weekend and the Davis Center Reopening Celebration, a moment that has welcomed back alumni to come together with current students, staff, and faculty to celebrate the reopening of the newly renovated Davis Center and honor the legacies of brothers W. Allison Davis, class of 1924, and John A. Davis, class of 1933, as well as Gaius C. Bolin, Sr., class of 1889, the first Black graduate of Williams College. The path-breaking legacy of Bolin made possible the power and voice of countless minoritized students and alumni who followed after and have helped shape the college. The Davis Center is part of this legacy, as for over 20 years it has served as a space to engage, educate, and empower our diverse community and help ensure Williams is a place where everyone has the opportunity to live, learn, and thrive. We are happy to welcome you back to campus for a weekend of listening, reflection, acknowledgement, restoration, and celebration. We've invited alumna Dr. Kendra Field, class of 1999, to engage with students and the public around our current exhibition, Emancipation, the Unfinished Project of Liberation, exploring topics related to the history and legacies of emancipation in the United States. This afternoon, she led a workshop helping students explore their own relationship to genealogy and heritage, and this evening she will present a lecture entitled The Stories We Tell, Understanding the Long History of African American Genealogy. She will touch upon the diversity of methods employed by historians and genealogists, descendants' often uneven access to the familial past, itself a legacy of American slavery, and the emergence of the recently launched 10 Million Names Project. Dr. Kendra Field is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University. She is the author of Growing Up with the Country, Family, Race, and Nation After the Civil War, published by Yale in 2018, which traced her own ancestors' experiences in slavery and the post-emancipation era. Her forthcoming book, The Stories We Tell, which will be published by Norton, is a history of African American genealogy and family storytelling from the Middle Passage to the present. Field abridged David Levering Lewis's W.E.B. Du Bois, A Biography, published by Henry Holt in 2009, and her scholarly articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, the Journal of African American History, Southern Cultures, and the American Historical Review. As a public historian, Field co-founded the African American Trail Project and the Du Bois Forum, a retreat for writers, scholars, and artists engaged in Black intellectual and artistic traditions. She served as project historian for the Du Bois Freedom Center, the first museum in North America dedicated to the life and work of W.E.B. Du Bois. She also co-curated Who We Believe in Freedom, Black Feminist DC, the inaugural exhibition in 2023 of the National Women's History Museum, and serves as chief historian for the 10 Million Names Project. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kendra Field.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you to Pamela Franks. Thank you to Roz Cruz, Destiny Fillmore, Kevin Murphy, Eloise, and the Williams College Art Museum for the really kind invitation. Thank you to all of you for being here today. And a special thanks to Allison and John Davis and their broader family, to Gordon Davis and many others who have shaped my work. So I'm going to speak with you today about, it's really, I should say, it's a pleasure to be back at Williams, especially on this weekend. I would not be a historian were it not for my time at Williams. I actually hated history as a high schooler, as I've said before. But I got to college and I got to take one of the very first classes that Craig Wilder taught, having finished his PhD at Columbia and come up to Williamstown, the author of Ebony and Ivy and many other wonderful books. And Craig taught me that my grandmother's stories, which I really adored, were actually part of history. And that kind of set me on the path with many diversions, but to eventually becoming a historian. So I'm going to say a special thanks to Craig Wilder and his time here at Williams. So I'm going to speak with you today about the history of African American genealogy and the importance of stories and silences. And I'm going to do, I think, 3 things. First, I'll share a bit about my own path into family history. I'm not going to lecture about that, but I'll show you some images and tell you a little bit about why I do this work. Second, I'll share a piece of my current book on the history of African American genealogy. And then finally, I'll introduce the 10 Million Names Project and talk about what that work is like, which is quite different. I'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I really look forward to a conversation and to your questions. All right, so I'm going to just share a couple images from my own family history that really shaped ultimately my work as a historian and a family historian. In particular, this picture of my grandmother in the 20s. And as I said, I grew up very close to her. I grew up in New York and New Jersey. I was born in Baltimore. She was living in East Orange, New Jersey, not far from me. But her stories were about Oklahoma, and especially the black towns of Oklahoma, centered largely in the Creek Nation, where our family was both African American and Creek Indian. And this was kind of a world apart from my experiences in New Jersey in the 70s and 80s. So it was a special place, and we'd go there every few years in the summer mostly, and gather stories about kind of widespread black land ownership after emancipation for a brief period of time before kind of Jim Crow really took root in Oklahoma, and also about Afro-Native family and communities and kin networks. This picture of my grandmother in the center, surrounded by her siblings, many of whom didn't talk as much as she did, didn't want to tell as many stories out of school. Some of whom had stayed in Oklahoma and had really good reasons for not sharing all the same information. But it kind of taught me about how descendants, even kind of siblings drawn from the same family history, could have really different relationships to the past and to their family and to family history. This is the kind of family homestead that my grandmother's parents and grandparents lived on in the early 20th century before she was born in Oklahoma. And this was kind of the postcards you could pick up in Oklahoma in the 80s and 90s of Indian Territory on the one hand and the black towns on the other hand. And it took me a while to realize that the story I was telling really required a more any kind of overlay of these two to really understand Afro-Native lives and experiences, which hadn't really received the attention of historians, although families and descendants knew this history quite well. So in the course of writing my dissertation, then my first book, I ended up kind of producing a map like this that allowed me to see the history of what were then called the all-black towns and the kind of indigenous roots of those towns, and the fact that many families crossed these communities quite thoroughly. My father passed away when I was in my 20s. He's a big part of the reason I ended up coming to Williams. He really loved this place. And when I was in my 20s, I took care of him the last couple years of his life. This is before I became a historian. And when he passed away, he'd had kidney disease for most of his life. His mother, who my grandmother I've been talking about, who's pictured here with the yellow hat, lived another 10 years after that. And so in those 10 years, she and I went back and forth to Oklahoma a great deal. She had uncles that were still living that were 97 and 103. And she also had, a wider extended family, like my great uncle Clifford in the top left there. And so almost all of my research trips, I was accompanied by my grandmother or my uncle Clifford or my uncle Prentice on the right, his brother, as we would go back to these places and talk to anyone that had either direct or indirect memories of the histories we were interested in. And at the time, I went to graduate school at this point. The year that my dad passed away, a few months later, I started a PhD program in history with a project that was not about our own ancestors, but I was meanwhile doing this with my grandmother and my uncle Clifford. And I came back to NYU, and I told my advisor a little bit about what we were collecting, and she said, you really should do something with that, or with those stories. And I said, is that allowed? Because the profession of history, like many professions and like many academic pursuits, had really been founded on the kind of myth of objectivity, right? That you couldn't research your own family or your own communities at a certain point. And she said, well, we'll see how it goes with the writing. There hadn't been, hi, I just saw you there. There hadn't really been a lot of, so nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. There hadn't been a lot done like this at the dissertation stage, right? There had been historians who later in life went and wrote about their family members, but there hadn't been kind of graduate level research in which, in the early 2000s at least, in which historians openly wrote about their own ancestors. I didn't know that for sure at the time. I didn't kind of think of it as the risk that perhaps I should have, until later when I started to research kind of what a privilege it had been to get to do this work for my family, with my family, in a way that also functioned as historical scholarship, right? And at that point, I went in a different direction. I started researching the history of early Black scholars and the ways in which they had to completely excise or kind of even deny their family relationships to their subject, right? The kind of covert ways that they did research their family, but they pretended it was not their own family. So George Washington Williams, famously in the late 19th century, writes a book about Black men's participation in the Civil War, Black soldiers' experiences. He himself had been a Black soldier in the Civil War, but you wouldn't know it if you read the book cover to cover, So these kinds of, kind of very natural, unnatural ways of distancing oneself from one's subject. I also got deeper into kind of the Afro-Native history of the family, which thankfully, for me in the early 2000s, Taya Miles' book, Ties That Bind, had just come out, and there was kind of a very early crop of books on Black and Native histories in the profession that were emerging. There had been some studies in anthropology and elsewhere, but there hadn't been a lot of mainstream historians taking on this subject until that point. And that meant that there were sources that I had in my own family that were speaking to the literature on the subject, right? I had a couple letters, I had a couple audio recordings, one actually, and other things where I thought, oh wait, this is valuable, and am I just supposed to ignore these things that we have, within our family, or can they somehow intersect with what we consider history? I ended up writing a book where each chapter traced one of my grandmother's grandparents, so my grandmother's grandfather, Monroe Coleman, her other grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Brown, that's his son on the top on the horse, and then Monroe Coleman's first cousin, Alexander Davis, and his wife, Della Watkins, and their children. Essentially chapter 1 is the Browns, chapter 2 is the Coleman, chapter 3 is the Davises. I trace each one of those grandparents, all of whom had been born enslaved or during the Civil War, migrated west to then Indian Territory around the turn of the 20th century. And then Indian Territory becomes Oklahoma. Oklahoma then becomes the state of, becomes the state of Oklahoma in 1907. And then at that point, Oklahoma ends up looking a great deal like like Mississippi. They adopt almost verbatim the Jim Crow laws that had been put in place in Mississippi. So they begin to look for the next thing, the next place, and they actually end up helping to found a Back to Africa movement in the early 20th century. But before I get to that, I wanted to try to share a little bit of audio, which I came upon late in this process. The dissertation was done. I was almost done with the book. And a cousin in California pointed me to a cassette tape that was actually in Jackson, Mississippi, that had never been digitized, and was a recording with, I was already writing about Alexander Davis and Della Watkins. Their daughter on the top left, Lomi Davis, was interviewed in the 1980s by her nephew, Cecil Cade. I'll see if this works.
On May 24th, 1987, Cecil Cade and Mark Phillips drove out to Prairie View to discuss family history with Cecil's aunt, Lomi Reed. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and we sat around the kitchen table, and Lomi talked with us for about 3 hours. The following are some excerpts edited from that conversation.
My mother's father was a Dave Black. He was mixed in there. I don't like this. I don't feel like him. Well, they didn't always marry, in favorite times, those like men would get turned out as a hundred.
I understand.
Slaves.
Yeah.
That's right. My children brothers.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that was my grandmother. I have two brothers married there. Uncle John and Uncle John. They just had to do whatever they told them.
So just a piece of it, but she says, my mother's father was a slave master. He was part Indian, mixed Indian, she says. And then she said, they didn't always marry in slavery times. And then she reemphasizes in slavery times and then talks about, essentially about sexual violence in the subsequent part of that excerpt. So, this is, it's not that common to have audio recording of, a child of a formerly enslaved woman, but it's also not, it's not like it never happened, right? And so there are these kind of rare audio files that do exist in places, and sometimes we don't always know where to look for them, but it was such this wonderful gift that happened towards the end of the book where I actually had this recording. I had little clips of this actually in a family reunion booklet, printed clips, Xeroxed many, many times over so you could barely read them by the 1990s. But this was actually the cassette, the audio from which that had been excerpted. Another kind of visual source I wanted to point to, and this is not, this has images of people who I think we were related to because it's the same church that they went to, was the Macedonia Baptist Church in Okmulgee. But broader than that, to understand any family history, you have to understand the place, right? And so what I came upon in the 2010s was that there had been a man named Sir Solomon Jones. They mix it up here, Solomon Sir, but Sir Solomon Jones basically had a video camera in the 1910s and 20s and taken a lot of footage of Oklahoma, Texas, and many other places. And so in Oklahoma, he actually filmed the church that my family went to in silent footage. But it was such a beautiful thing because we so rarely have, especially in rural areas, film footage of the communities where our families lived. And so this is a Texas piece that I'll show you, but it's of a Juneteenth parade in 1925. And I truly hate to pause this, but it is available online. If you were to Google Solomon Sir Jones films, it was found in Oklahoma, the footage, and then it was digitized by the Beinecke Library. There was a big auction, but Beinecke at Yale got it, and they digitized it, and it's publicly available. Long story short, a few years before that footage is taken, they purchased this ship on the far left, which was had been a German steamship, and they put wireless technology on it, right? Wireless radio, not today's wireless, because it was a couple years after the sinking of the Titanic. And They hired a crew. This was a kind of a collaborative effort between a number of folks, a lot of folks actually, in Oklahoma, and then also a Ghanaian man named Alfred Charles Sam and a few of his colleagues. So that story, actually there's a Williams part of that story that forms the epilogue of this book. A colleague of mine from Williams, Ebony Coletu, she and I ran into each other at the Williams Club in New York. And I was talking about this research on Alfred Charles Sam and the participation of my grandmother's grandfather, Monroe Coleman, and his cousin, Alexander Davis, whose daughter you were listening to. He actually died in West Africa. Monroe Coleman went as one of the 60 delegates in 1914, comes back at the end of that next year. And I was talking a little bit about this research, and Ebony let me know that her ancestors also had the Sam name on the Ghanaian side. And Ebony had been a year ahead of me at Williams. And so we crossed paths, we started digging, and then we wrote an article together where I traced kind of the Black Oklahoma side, my family's connection to this movement, and she traced the Ghanaian side, and she did all of the digging, in and around Accra. And then we kind of wrote together about our kind of shared family history. So we've talked at Williams about that before, so I'm not going to go into it now, but that's kind of that movement was the kind of epilogue of my book. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you this one other clip, I think, and then move forward. But this, sorry. This is Kari Jones, who's now my husband, but was not my husband when we started this. Actually, sorry, that's very loud, and I'm going to jump ahead here. This is when they return from Ghana. They return through Liverpool and then through Ellis Island. So they're kind of returning in 1915 with these kind of dashed hopes of, at the same time that all these other folks are coming into the U.S. with similar hopes with, in terms of why they left. And then we had a gathering of all the descendants who had been attached to that movement that wanted to come.
The Chief movement. It's been 100 years, almost to the week, that they left for the Gold Coast. I don't believe anyone else has marked it as such. We were thinking maybe we just have a moment of silence here in memory of what they were hoping to achieve, what they did achieve, and of their lives.
Okay. So that was the project that I did first, and that was really my kind of entree into family history, bringing together the work of historians, the archival evidence I could have access to, and the important knowledge that we had within our family networks. And I wanted to just say that kind of like in the course of that process, my initial knowledge came from family stories. But while I followed the lead of those stories, I was kind of testing memories and hypotheses and speculation against the archival record and also against the recollections of others who had traveled the same routes. And by the end, I was like much more interested in how and why certain details were retold and remembered the way they were, and why others were buried or never narrated in the first place. So in the distance between, how the past was remembered and how it may have in fact happened, including family stories that sometimes distanced or silenced experiences of enslavement or experiences of certain kinds of violence, and some that kind of clung to certain forms of privilege, whether that was class or color or free status. So writing about my own family history led me to the project I'm finishing now, which is called The Stories We Tell. And this project is really about the efforts of generations of African American families to access and share their familial pasts. In his 1892 autobiography, Frederick Douglass wrote, "The reader must not expect me to say much of my family. Genealogical trees did not flourish among slaves." And for a while, I kind of, took this for granted, even though what I knew kind of oftentimes flew in the face of it. Forcibly separated from our family members by the First and Second Middle Passage, by slavery and the slave trade, we know that ancestors were also separated to varying degrees from their family histories. Just as enslaved children were stunned when they found out they could be sold, their descendants today, we know, continue to grapple with that kind of twin legacy, the deprivation of family history or family history knowledge. But what I encountered over time was, and what I knew in many ways from the families I was engaging with, is that fragments of family lore, however fragmentary, spanning Africa, the Caribbean, the United States, circulated and held value even among enslaved women, men, and children and free people of color long before the Civil War. So I became interested in kind of what stories about the past were passed down long before we think of the birth of African American genealogy, certainly long before Alex Haley's Roots, as important as that book was and the release of the miniseries was. So I started to think of this project as kind of Roots before Roots. In the Civil War era and immediately after emancipation, I saw in the archive people changing their birth dates or beginning to pass as white or as Indian in efforts to distance or obscure family histories of enslavement. But I also saw others who were kind of proudly proclaiming their free African heritage, really the early roots of what becomes modern Black nationalism. You could see that in how people were parsing genealogies and genealogical stories. In that larger Back to Africa movement, which spans all of American history, all of African American history for sure, but especially was prominent in the Reconstruction period and onward. And I can show an image of one of those ships. There's a woman named Cheney Mack who was interviewed about the loss of her father. She was in her early 20s in post-emancipation Georgia, and she lost her father, she would put it, to the Back to Africa movement. Some years before the outbreak of the Civil War, Cheney's father had been born, in fact, free in Africa, near Liberia, Cheney recalled. At 18 years old, having been lured onto a ship with his brother on the premise of delivering a package, quote, and this is his daughter's words, before they knew it, the boat had pulled off from the landing. These passengers were smuggled into Georgia and sold by illegal slave traders. And as a child, herself born into slavery in the decade before the war, Cheney would sit on her father's lap, she recalled, while he, quote, he'd tell me all about when he lived in Africa. He played music and sang about, quote, the good old land. And then, quote, he would cry when he thought of his mother back there. Then one morning in the 1880s, Cheney's father just disappeared, she recalled. A bishop had come to the church, quote, to talk about taking them back to Africa, and, quote, my daddy walked off the next day, and we've never seen or heard from him since. He didn't come home that night or the next. He was just homesick. And so this Back to Africa story is actually a story of a return to one's family, a return home in the 1880s period. And that's somewhat uncommon, but not entirely uncommon, because slave ships continued to come in until the outbreak of the Civil War, essentially illegally. So these stories in the late 19th century sometimes we're talking about an actual return to one's home place. And those stories should remind us all that there was no kind of blank slate that, yes, people had memories and they brought them with them, and they never let go of them. They held quite tightly to them precisely because of efforts of slave traders and owners to interrupt family knowledge. Throughout the immediate post-emancipation era, however, for many, shame and silence about the past prevailed. And the wonderful historian Darlene Clark Hine perhaps said it best when she noted the many dimensions of our past that some believed, quote, better left unknown, unwritten, or unspoken, except in whispered tones. So this is a picture of Fisk Jubilee singer and pianist Ella Shepherd, who recalled in 1911, quote, the slave songs were associated with slavery in the dark past and represented the things to be forgotten. She had been born enslaved and separated from her mother as a toddler. By the 1870s, Shepherd was a student at Fisk University and one of the first Jubilee singers whose creations and talent really saved Fisk University. They achieved this with their 1870s fundraising tours, performing spirituals across the US and across Europe. But Ella Shepherd said they never intended to sing those songs. The slave songs, Shepherd recalled later, were never used by us then in public. She recalled how she and the other singers, quote, finally grew willing to sing them privately. The students would return to the Fisk president's sitting room time and again in the coming weeks and months. Sitting upon the floor, she said, we practiced softly, learning from each other the songs of our fathers. Still, she said, we did not dream of ever using them in public. And that quote really became kind of the beginning of this project for me, because I was interested in that first statement that said, essentially, they were the things to be forgotten, but also the second that said that they were the songs of our fathers, they were sacred, they were used in religious practice, right? So there was this kind of bifurcation of like public memory. They were meant to be forgotten publicly, but privately they remained sacred, and that divide was actually a necessary part, in some ways, of becoming free in that moment, right? And that changes, of course, in the midst of desegregation, the civil rights era, but in this Jim Crow era, you can kind of see this really important kind of compartmentalization of African American memory. W.B. Du Bois memorialized Shepherd's life in an obituary in The Crisis in 1914, describing her as one of the original Fisk Jubilee singers. Born in Western Massachusetts, right, South County down here, Du Bois had been a student 3 decades prior at Fisk University and had learned then of the debt that he and his fellow students owed Shepherd and the Jubilee Singers. For Du Bois, their spirituals, which he described as both familiar and strange to him, were interwoven in the knowledge he received about his own ancestors' enslavement. Ever since I was a child, these songs have stirred me strangely, he recalled. They came out of the South unknown to me, one by one, and yet at once I knew them as of me and as of mine. As Du Bois wrote in The Souls of Black Folk, my grandmother's grandmother was seized by an evil Dutch trader 2 centuries ago, and he goes on to discuss how these songs traveled down. He calls them the siftings of centuries. Indeed, by the turn of the 20th century, as the children of freedom's first generation came of age, they brought with them a growing openness to the heritage of slavery and renewed interest in the familial and collective past. The rise of Black immigration, the Black press, generated national and transnational ideas about peoplehood and racial destiny. So while African Americans continued to search for individual family members, they also began to construct the history of a people. African Americans of diverse backgrounds and disparate means increasingly took up what they called then the future of the race, and in turn the quest for a more usable past. By 1900, 4 million enslaved women and men were at the center of attention of an increasingly collective memory of slavery. Carter Woodson, founder of Negro History Week, which becomes later Black History Month, writes about all aspects of African American history, including the history of slavery. He himself is born to 2 formerly enslaved individuals, but he doesn't talk about that piece, right? Du Bois, similarly, in Souls of Black Folk, his literary work mentions his familial history of slavery, but in his scholarship, say his dissertation on the suppression of the slave trade, does not mention his family connection. So that's what I was kind of pointing to a little bit earlier, kind of the privilege of being able to engage with one's own ancestry in the context of a work of scholarship. For these early Black scholars like Woodson and Du Bois, Anna Julie Cooper, and many others, that was out of the question. In their more private writings, however, they would mention bits and pieces of their family history. And so I kind of began the process of kind of documenting their own journeys in relationship to their family history. I skip forward a little bit, but you have instead, as I said, instead of going into the realm of scholarship, a lot of this family history went into the literature realm. So you have Langston Hughes and others of the Harlem Renaissance writing about, as in his poem, Aunt Sue's Stories, or poems by Georgia Douglas Johnson on the passing of the ex-slave, because by the 1920s and 30s, you have many former, like the last generation of formerly enslaved individuals have passed away or are passing away. And so you see this kind of incredible renaissance in terms of memories, family memories that are perhaps disappearing. And most importantly, this generation began to advocate for the active collection of stories and practices and folklore from their elders, what we would today call genealogy. This is a few sketches from Du Bois's own genealogical work. I found throughout his papers that far less known than his kind of public engagements. He actually was a very avid genealogist. He was traveling to the Bahamas and to Haiti to reconstruct his father's family history. as well as his mother's family history here and in the Hudson Valley of New York. He was writing letters to anyone with the last name Du Bois, whether they were black or white. Sometimes he was disguising himself as white in his letters in order to get family history information from the white Du Boises. I mean, he really had a genealogical life that was quite detailed and in-depth, but it was private, and sometimes it's on the back of his sociological or historical work, right? Literally, you turn the paper over, and there he has his own family history or version of his family tree. He had many versions, like the one in the center. Or the work of Ophelia Settle Egypt, who was born in Texas and studied at Howard University. She was a sorority sister of Zora Neale Hurston at Howard. And she wanted to become a sociologist. This was very early. There were very few black women receiving their PhDs. Anna Julie Cooper was among the first. And Ophelia Settle Egypt ended up shifting from sociology to social work. But before she did that, she had a job working at Fisk University for Charles Spurgeon Johnson, the black sociologist. And this is totally on topic with Allison Davis's life here. And because they both were in that Chicago world. And Ophelia Settle Egypt is sent out into Nashville to interview essentially African-American men and women about their working conditions and about their pay and about the economics of their lives. So she goes out and she starts doing these interviews, and she comes back to Charles Johnson at a soul food, what we would call it now a soul food restaurant, but it was called something different then, that she refers to later in life as a soul food restaurant, but in the 20s it wasn't referred to that way. And so she comes back to him, and they're sitting at this place called Ma Mina's in Nashville and discussing the early results, and she said, yeah, I got that information, but did you know the people that I'm interviewing were all enslaved as children and adolescents? And that's what they want to talk about. And so he said, well, he gave her kind of the go-ahead to go and do that and to follow her impulse on this. And so she collected the stories of over 100 formerly enslaved women and men in the 1920s, more than a decade before the federal government took any interest in this in, say, the WPA interviews that we more commonly know about. And I have found that HBCUs in particular, Fisk, but also Hampton, were, not surprisingly, decades ahead of the rest of the country and certainly of the federal government in caring about these stories and the oral history and the genealogies. All right, well, I want to give us time for questions. So I'm going to kind of turn to 10 million names in a moment and then conclude. So over the course of the 20th century, African-American women and men often put space, literally and symbolically, between themselves and their forebears, especially, for instance, in the Great Migration. 20th century civil rights and black power movements spawned new forms of diasporic thinking about black peoplehood and genealogy, culminating with the 1976 publication of Alex Haley's Roots. Of one ancestral quest during this period, Dorothy Redford, descendant and genealogist of the North Carolina Somerset plantation, she recalled, "I began as a woman alone, drifting in both time and space." And this is an event she put on the right there. "But by the end, I had a past peopled with links as strong and solid as any family in this nation." As she pieced together the lives of their ancestors and organized a reunion on the grounds, all the slaves, quote, all the slaves on the plantation became her people, unquote. In the same period, E. Frances White, the scholar, black feminist scholar at NYU, recalled that her family, quote, worked hard to develop strong black egos in its children and thus sent her to spend a week with her grandfather every summer. He was a follower of Marcus Garvey and, quote, had an impressive library filled with everything he could find on Africa and its diaspora, unquote. Growing up in the post-civil rights era, I was raised under the kind of haunting influence of Roots and a tradition of regular family reunions. This was really the 1980s renaissance in African-American family history. And as we're all aware by now, the 21st century has brought genealogical software and genetic genealogy, the DNA industry, to bear on the project of African-American family histories. Nevertheless, the African-American drive to recover our ancestors continues to be haunted by this kind of break at the heart of American slavery. And so I'm going to talk now about this project, 10 Million Names. This is a genealogical project, right? It's founded by, has anyone heard of it? You raise your hand if you've heard of it. Okay. So it's a project of the umbrella of the New England Historic Genealogical Society and American Ancestors in partnership with the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society, that's a lot of words, and many other organizations. It can only happen as a collaborative project. This project is attempting to do something that I know would have been done in 1977, especially after the airing of Alex Haley's Roots on ABC. Had we had the kind of confluence we have right now of resources, namely money, and the technology, things like being able to scan tens of thousands of documents in cursive before they've been transcribed by someone, right? And the kind of collective will to make it happen. So when I talk about this project, I talk about it kind of joining this long tradition that is centuries long and trying to kind of connect up pre-existing efforts, collecting efforts, data sets, historical initiatives, especially Black-led historical initiatives across the country with great regional specificity, right? People who are documenting the names of people buried in unmarked graves across the country in cemeteries. People who have plantation ledgers, the descendants of slave owners who, since the launch of this project, have been sending in, here's what I found in our attic, these are the people that our family owned. Also, the descendants of enslaved, and some who are the descendants of both of those populations, right, who have incredibly meaningful and powerful information, both names and also sometimes stories. So it's an effort to recover the names of families of the estimated 10 million women, men, and children of African descent who were enslaved between 1520s, more specific than this, and 1865. Most importantly for me, it's kind of a collaboration between historians and genealogists, and none of these people are historians or genealogists that I'm showing you right now, but they are really important advisors, especially, of course, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on the project. But it's been kind of a lower level exciting thing for me is to be able to kind of facilitate work between historians and genealogists who typically don't get along, I think I can say that, or they do get along in small ways. So I had a great experience with a lot of genealogists, especially in Oklahoma, especially genealogists who are really well versed in kind of the descendants of the freedmen, the Creek and the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and Seminole. But in a broader level, you don't often see professional historians and professional genealogists working together. They do kind of different stuff, but they also really need each other, especially if we're trying to go forward in time or backward in time. Or when they go backward, they might need to know, but why did this outmigration happen? What was happening? What historical context shapes this genealogical story, right? And so I came on as chief historian, and I was able to, well, Skip was already involved, but I was able to bring on Vince Brown, Tavolia Glimpf, Carrie Greenidge, Brandon Terry. And then they also simultaneously build up a genealogist council of kind of leading Black genealogists who basically are a tremendous resource in helping to guide the project. So we go to different places, we look for different things. Like I know what's at the archives at Fisk really well and what's at Howard's Moreland Spingarn collection really well. A little bit of what's at Hampton, right? Genealogists don't typically work with those archives, but they know how to do really, really like deep digging into sources that I don't always, know about or know where to find. And so working together has been a really exciting part of this project. And then the other really important part for me is the redirecting of resources to long-standing existing archives. So, archives like the Fisk archive that maybe only have one archivist full-time, right? Where we can say, what would be a valuable way that this project could help to support the preservation of records related to Black lives historically, that are present in this archive, right? What are some institutions that have been out there this whole time, right? That a few scholars have been making use of, right? But that really require some care and that are vulnerable to destruction. So making sure that we can do that kind of work. I'm gonna conclude. So I want to note before closing that I don't approach family history work as principally about biology, blood, or DNA. I haven't really talked about DNA at all, but about kinship and attachment. So who parented whom, who cared for whom, that's really part and parcel of, I think, all communities, and especially the case in African American history, that was necessary, important, and valuable. I try to write and rewrite into my stories the names of non-biological relations who were not kind of nevertheless family, but who were necessarily family, as well as the names of biological relations, including children born outside of legal marriages or the children of second, third, or hidden families about whom others dared not speak. Now this changes depending on how close we are to the present, but I do try, we try to understand the historical forces that shape people's lives and to have, to the extent that we can, a great deal of empathy for what people are up against. In this way, I try to, the stories I share attempt to fill the space between the official truth of lineage or property and inheritance and the unofficial truth of who people parented, comforted, or struggled alongside. As E. Francis White writes, the stories that we refuse to tell, oh, I missed it, do matter. I often say that two emotions lie at the heart of my work, pride and shame. Pride being the stories that we tell and retell over and over again with a very distinct purpose when it matters most, and shame, the stories that we bury, hide, erase, or never tell. This work is about storytelling and equally about silence. It is about how and why certain details were remembered and others never narrated. In short, it's about the other work that our ancestors did, the tear-stained work that happened often behind closed doors and when no one was watching, to quilt together the loose ends, longings, unspeakable truths, and silences. In closing, long before I cared for the discipline of history, my grandmother's made me whole, pointing to things that I sensed, but for which I had no words. In recent years, psychologists have begun to examine what I think human beings have long understood, what they call the importance of a strong intergenerational self, children knowing that they belong to something bigger than themselves. And one study revealed that in the face of conflict, uncertainty, and trauma, the more children know about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, and the higher their self-esteem. These findings may have particular implications that I think are both urgent and hopeful in our communities. And I'll close slightly more personally. Like many historians, I first learned the meaning of change over time and over space or geography within my own family, as I listened to mythical stories of long-lost Black land ownership from the vantage point of the post-civil rights era, and as I watched my father, who was chronically ill, decline, a pillar of our family fall, and my world ever so gradually collapse. Surrounded by secrets and the ever-present threat of separation through the passage of time and space, my job, first as a daughter and then later as a historian, became putting the pieces back together. I wanted to know how one generation shaped the next and why these stories were repeated and where the shadows came from. I was drawn unconsciously to what the writer Susanna Lessard calls the family architecture. Like Lessard, this architecture taught me how short time is, how close the generations are, how powerfully lives reverberate down through the structure of family, deeply affecting each other. Because in our witting or unwitting response to those reverberations, quote, we in turn create the unseen structure in which our children must live. Thank you. And I would love to hear your questions and any comments or thoughts. Yes?
Did I understand you to say that the group who went back to Africa came back to the States? Mm-hmm. Why?
Outbreak of World War I and influenza, known then as the Spanish flu, all of that happened right when they were leaving. It was unfortunate. And a great number of people died upon arrival or shortly thereafter. So the survivors came back by way of Liverpool to New York, back to Oklahoma.
Thank you so much for sharing this.
Yeah.
This is such important work. So I'm kind of curious, too, of thinking about the disjunctures as well within family histories, especially African American histories, where we don't necessarily have the records, but we hear the stories you're descended from, so-and-so, you're descended from this. And so how that might, or is, or not brought in to this project, or to be able to verify or imagine creative, or put to life,
Yeah.
right? In terms of those kinds of stories that can't quite be reconciled.
Yeah.
As well as, and I know specifically you said not doing DNA work, right, which I also appreciate, but where that also might come in or not as these ideas of kinship and who's included and not included,
Right.
particularly thinking of people who might have been passing, have been kind of severed from family lines.
Right. They're really good questions. Thank you. Well, I like to say that historians question everything. They question the oral history. They also question the written records. That they're pretty much all of it's wrong and all of it's right in some sense. So I think that it's great when you have like written records and oral history, and you can kind of match them up or put them alongside one another. But I think even when you only have the written record, we approach it with a skeptical eye. In the context of the project I mentioned, the kind of massive 10 million names project, the important part is that any name would be attached to records, right? So it's really a catalog of records. So if there was a name before the Civil War that someone went by, and then a name after the Civil War that someone went by, and we can never say, is that the same person or there's two people, right? It's hard to know. That's why we never wanted to detach a name from a record, right? Because in some ways it's all remains should remain somewhat ambiguous. We never want to kind of have some database of names that's detached from the source from which we know, right? Because it wouldn't be something that would last, I think. It would stand up against the test of time. On the second question, I write a lot about racial categories and how malleable they are over time. And of course, between 1910 and 1920, one of my mentors, David Living Lewis, in his Du Bois biography always says, 500,000 people disappeared from the census because the category of mulatto disappeared, as you well know, in the US federal census between those decades. And so you lose people who begin passing as white. Other people who were categorized as mulatto begin being categorized as black. I think all of that's incredibly valuable in terms of what it does to family trees. Segregation actually, the segregation of libraries even, disconnected branches of family tree very forcibly, right? And so we have to always be thinking about that, like who's considered part of a family and who's not, and why, has a lot to do with, with the history of capitalism and with resources and with racism. And so that's part of this story too. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. No. I wasn't looking for an exact,
exact
answer, but more just wanted to hear your thoughts because this is such brilliant work.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm also kind of curious here. Sorry, about how diasporic it might be as well when you were talking about all these connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can't talk about the history of slavery in the U.S. without talking about the Caribbean and Latin America and the continent. I think people try to. So, that 10 Million Names Project, it started with the U.S. and we were like, now we're dealing with the Caribbean, and now they're in the Virgin Islands, and now we're here. So I think it moves. But record keeping happened in really different ways in different places.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Just curious, how you started talking at the beginning, you spent some time talking about the whole African American and Native American blending in Oklahoma. I'm just curious how that throws another wrinkle in all of this research.
Yeah. It sure does, yeah. And also the relationship between slavery and race and the U.S. So in my family history and the book that I wrote, I was tracing people who were in part enslaved by Creek slave owners, or people who were part Creek and part European American. And then I also was tracing African Americans who settled on Indian Territory land and purchased Creek allotments and were essentially participating in what scholars call kind of settler expansion. And so it's a complicated story where it's not like a one directional. In many cases in early Oklahoma, there really weren't that many white Americans. It was mostly African American and Native American, and yet the U.S. government was functioning in this way where it was like inserting and requiring a certain kind of racial categories that might have made sense, although it typically did not, in another part of the country, but definitely didn't make sense in Indian Territory. So in the case of the the history of African American genealogy, as I tell it, is also about people who themselves or their parents were African born and were telling stories and continuing genealogies that existed principally on the continent. Also people who were the descended from Creek or Cherokee mothers and African or African American fathers, and blended all of those family histories into one. In some cases, they were enslaved alongside each other in the earlier period when you have Native Americans enslaved alongside Africans and African Americans in the Sea Islands and also in New England. It also includes people who had parents or grandparents who were white. So Du Bois, Pauline Hopkins all kind of contend that in the post-emancipation era, about 1 in 3 people who we would later call African American had a white parent or grandparent, right? So a significant number of people who descended also from white slave owners or other people in the community, but who were never considered family, right, because of the emergence of Jim Crow. And so that's why when I kind of talk about African American the genealogical tradition, it's actually a pretty diverse thing. But what I'm interested in is, but we call it that in some ways because of the history of American racism. One more, okay, in the back. Well, let's take 2 more.
I am a genealogist as well, and I got my start in genealogy researching my family history in Oklahoma, where Chickasaw Freedmen.
Oh, wonderful.
And I then moved on to like lots of other black families and trying to identify formerly enslaved ancestors. But then I did, for a white friend, her family history, and it was shocking to me the amount of documents that existed
Yes.
for white folks
Right.
compared to what my experience had been so far
Right.
with black folks. And what I found were a couple of enslavers in her family line, and I was able to really flesh out stories and family lines of their enslaved folks through the white folks' documents.
Exactly.
And so I guess it raises for me the question of what role you see white folks playing, particularly in 10 Million Names, but also just, you know, in their family histories and figuring out additional sources for black folks. I know you mentioned earlier that some white folks have been submitting information. Is that part of what you're at?
I think it is, and the organization New England Historic Genealogical Society was historically, you know, like the Mayflower organization to kind of shrink it down, right? So their members historically have not been principally African American, right? And so they're getting a lot of contributions from descendants of slave owners and others who have records that are valuable. Thank you for the work that you have done, and I would say that to write about, you know, at a certain point, I lost the voices of the people I cared most about, right? And then I would shift to the slave owners, right? This is in my first project. And so the Coleman family, I had Monroe Coleman, and I even lost the names, right? I had Monroe Coleman back to the 1850s. I had his mother, Keziah, back to the 1830s. And then at that point, I had to shift to the slave owners, the Coleman slave owners who moved from and I could trace them from Mississippi to Alabama, and before that back to Virginia and the Carolinas, and before that back to Scotland. So I could go pretty far back when I shifted to the slave owners, but what we lose then, and it's important work, as you know, but what I was interested in as a storyteller was kind of interiority, like the interior lives, that stuff that gets us to kind of connect on and to see people's like humanity and struggles and successes and failures, and to see people in the kind of complexity that, say, Zora Neale Hurston was after in her work. And so that gets harder and harder the further that we go back.
For this, and I'm not entirely sure how to phrase the question, but I wonder to what extent you sort of grappled with how the methods within potentially academia around for historians or for genealogists have in and of themselves been inadequate at capturing this, and for that I would go back to what you were saying in your presentation about early scholars even distancing themselves from the work, which, you know, in my mind seems to be a product of existing within a system that had prized a separation through a kind of dehumanization, or even now categorization, the way that you say, in order to facilitate that kind of system. And then seeing the legacy of that play out in the development of the tools that we use to do research and to excavate knowledge, and wondering if that is a hindrance to really, unraveling the complexity that you're talking about that exists within people, but also across time as well. So yeah, just curious about that from a method standpoint, and whether or not, and how that sort of factors.
Yeah, that was pretty spot on. Good question. I think that so when I was writing that piece called The Privilege of Family History, I was thinking about family history as a form of resistance in a way. And it was something that a lot of Black scholars and writers and artists were doing, like in spite of the structures they were either living in or working under. Zora Neale Hurston being one of the best examples of this, but also Du Bois, also many others, Ophelia Settle Egypt for sure. Taking the tools that they were learning in those disciplines and then using them in ways they weren't intended. And then creating in some ways, and taking advantage of whatever was available to them to do the kind of memorial work that was so important. And I think it's also important to remember that during the period Du Bois was kind of separating himself from his family history and putting one into the Souls of Black Folk and then something else into his scholarship. This is the same moment when the Dunning School is kind of reigning supreme in American history. And the Dunning School was a professor, last name Dunning, at Columbia University, who was teaching this very racist kind of lost cause narrative of the Civil War, and his students were going out and producing incredibly awful books that kind of were in lockstep with the Jim Crow era across the country. But some of Dunning's students were themselves the children of Confederate soldiers, right? They were also drawing on their familial experiences, right? And so I think it's important to also say that like the history of the academy more broadly is never far from, from one's own life experiences and perception of who's winning and who's losing, right? And so we would always do well, I think, to research the upbringings and early influences on any individual who's engaged in a project, and to ask them to share with us, why they're on the path they're on. Thank you. Thank you.